He bought a cheap ship at auction, but an alien woman inside. Rhett Kael didn't believe in fate. But standing in the stink of engine grease and desperation on the edge of an illegal auction platform, something shifted. He wasn't just broke, he was cornered, hunted by past mistakes and haunted by a galaxy that had long since stopped caring. The auction was chaos. Angry voices. Twitchy fingers. The kind of place where one wrong glance got you stabbed, or worse, sold. Most of the ships were wrecks, dented haulers with patchy hulls, military relics barely held together by rust and reputation. Garbage. Then everything stopped. At the far end of the hangar, buried in shadows, sat a ship that didn't belong. Midnight black. Seamless. Pulsing. Its surface shimmered with blue veins like living circuitry, and it exhaled a hum, deep, ancient, alive. Lot 47, the auctioneer croaked through a static-choked speaker. No ID tag. No owner. Found drifting in the outer belt. No warranties. No refunds. Starting bid, 5,000 credits. Laughter. Nervous murmurs. Cursed ship, someone whispered. Ghost ship, another muttered. But Kael couldn't move. He felt it, like a magnet buried in his chest, pulling him toward it. The air crackled around him. 6,000, a voice called. Kael's heart hammered. He should have walked away. He didn't. 7,000, he said, almost without thinking. The auctioneer slammed the gavel. Sold. And with one word, Rhett Kael traded every credit he had for a mystery cloaked in shadows. He had no idea the ship had already chosen him. He approached cautiously. The vessel's hull shimmered under the docking bay lights. No seams, no visible engines. The ramp lowered on its own, releasing a hiss of chilled air. Inside was darkness, and something else. Presence. The floor glowed with soft bioluminescent patterns under his boots. The corridors curved organically, like they'd grown rather than been built. No control panels. No markings. Just a pulse, like the ship was breathing. Then, movement. A single pod at the rear of the ship glowed faintly blue. Frost covered the glass. Inside lay a woman. Blue-skinned. Silver hair. A bodysuit that looked like armor fused with ritual. Red sigils pulsed along her limbs like circuitry. Even unconscious, she radiated danger. The pod hissed. Her eyes opened, brilliant gold, sharp enough to slice through lies. She sat up slowly, regal and rigid. The ship responded to her immediately. Lights flared. Systems activated. And then she spoke, her voice layered through the ship's AI. By ZTH law, she said, you are now my husband. Kael stumbled back. What? But the ship was already coming alive around them. Engines thrummed. Consoles flared to life. The ship detached itself from the station. Alarms wailed across the hangar. He turned to the woman. What the hell is happening? She stood tall, golden eyes locked on his. You have bonded with the Void Dancer. The ritual has begun. I bought a ship, not a wife. She tilted her head. You misunderstand ZTH law. Marriage is not a social contract. It is a merging of purpose. Spirit. Survival. Kael looked at the door, looked at the pod, looked at the controls lighting up under his fingertips. He didn't know what the hell was going on. But he knew one thing. He approached cautiously. The vessel's hull shimmered under the docking bay lights. No seams, no visible engines. The ramp lowered on its own, releasing a hiss of chilled air. Inside was darkness, and something else. Presence. The floor glowed with soft bioluminescent patterns under his boots. The corridors curved organically, like they'd grown rather than been built. No control panels. No markings. Just a pulse, like the ship was breathing. Then, movement. A single pod at the rear of the ship glowed faintly blue. Frost covered the glass. Inside lay a woman. Blue-skinned. Silver hair. A bodysuit that looked like armor fused with ritual. Red sigils pulsed along her limbs like circuitry. Even unconscious, she radiated danger. The pod hissed. Her eyes opened, brilliant gold, sharp enough to slice through lies. She sat up slowly, regal and rigid. The ship responded to her immediately. Lights flared. Systems activated. And then she spoke, her voice layered through the ship's AI. By ZTH law, she said, you are now my husband. Kael stumbled back. What? But the ship was already coming alive around them. Engines thrummed. Consoles flared to life. The ship detached itself from the station. Alarms wailed across the hangar. He turned to the woman. What the hell is happening? She stood tall, golden eyes locked on his. You have bonded with the Void Dancer. The ritual has begun. I bought a ship, not a wife. She tilted her head. You misunderstand ZTH law. Marriage is not a social contract. It is a merging of purpose. Spirit. Survival. Kael looked at the door, looked at the pod, looked at the controls lighting up under his fingertips. He didn't know what the hell was going on. But he knew one thing. This ship had plans for him. The ship drifted through the stars, silent and predatory. Rhett Kael sat in the pilot's seat, but it wasn't his hands guiding the vessel, it was something deeper, something woven into his bones. The controls responded to every breath, every pulse of fear and disbelief running through him. Behind him, the woman moved like a shadow, watchful, restrained. Her golden eyes never blinked. He glanced over his shoulder. You gonna kill me, or just keep staring? She didn't answer right away. That unsettled him more than a blade to the throat would've. Aelira V'Lan, she finally said, voice low and sharp. Battle priestess of the ZTH Empire. Defender of the last flame. Kael turned fully. That's supposed to mean something to me. It will. Her gaze was calculating, like she was measuring him against something ancient and terrible. Her posture was rigid, ceremonial almost, but there was something off in her expression, like her armor didn't quite hold anymore. Why were you in stasis? Aelira hesitated. Not from weakness, he could feel the tension in her shoulders, the resistance. She wasn't used to talking. She was used to commanding. I failed, she said simply. 2 words. Final. Heavy. But Kael heard everything that came with them. I was the last of my order. The Empire collapsed. My people turned on each other. The Void Dancer was our final sanctuary, our final weapon. When the traitors came, I sealed myself inside and locked the ship away. She didn't look at him while she spoke. She stared into the stars, like she was still watching the galaxy burn. And now, he asked. Now it chooses again. Kael exhaled slowly. Lucky me. She stepped closer, slow and deliberate, until she stood just beside the pilot's chair. Not threatening. Not friendly. Something in between. You're not what I expected. Believe me, Kael muttered, I hear that a lot. Aelira studied him. Her eyes weren't just gold, they were ancient. Carved by war, but not devoid of compassion. Not entirely. Kael saw the storm she carried behind her stillness. He'd seen storms like that in men who'd watched their crews die and kept walking. You fought, she said quietly. Not well. But you've survived. Kael's jaw tensed. I've buried people who were better than me. And yeah, I've survived. Mostly by being too stubborn to die. She tilted her head slightly, as if cataloging him anew. Then the ship responded. Lights dimmed. A panel slid open near the helm, revealing a crystalline structure pulsing with slow, glowing life. It beat like a second heart. The bond. Kael felt a hum in his chest, like the ship was calling to something buried deep inside him. Something he didn't know he still had. What is that? He asked, already knowing the answer. Aelira's voice was soft. The neural bridge. It is how the void dancer links its chosen. You and me. Why me? He said. I'm no one. I've run cargo for smugglers, worked black market salvage routes, screwed up more contracts than I've finished. Why the hell would a legendary warship pick me? Aelira didn't speak. Not at first. Then she said, because the ship sees through what you were. It sees what you are. Broken. But not hollow. The words hit harder than he expected. Kael turned to the glowing heart of the ship. And if I don't want this? If I walk away? Her voice was colder this time. Then it will tear you out. Piece by piece. The room went still. A silence deeper than vacuum. Kael looked at her again. So we're bound. Just like that? No, she said. Not yet. Not fully. But you've started it. And once it begins, the only way is forward. He looked back at the controls, now quietly pulsing under his palms. Not just light, but heat. Emotion. Intention. And under it all, the question that wouldn't let go. Was this destiny? Or was he just the last fool standing in the right place at the wrong time? Either way, the void dancer had him. And so did she. The void dancer moved through the black like it belonged there, silent, aware, alive. Rhett Kael leaned forward in the pilot's seat, trying not to think about the woman standing behind him. Her presence was a pressure, not violent, but constant. Like gravity. Aelira hadn't spoken since explaining the bond. But her eyes hadn't left him either. Kael broke the silence. You keep looking at me like I'm gonna break. You might, she said evenly. That's comforting. It's not meant to be. He laughed, but it didn't carry. There was too much tension in the room, too much unsaid. And the ship felt it. Lights dimmed slightly. The air thickened. He turned to face her. Let's just get this out of the way. You don't want me here. Aelira's jaw clenched. She didn't deny it. I'm not an idiot, Kael went on. I wasn't supposed to be the one who found this ship. You were planning to take it back. Alone. Aelira crossed her arms. The void dancer requires 2 pilots. But not me. Silence. Kael stood up, facing her fully now. So what was the plan? Let me activate it, get it flying again, then toss me out the nearest airlock. Her expression flickered. Not guilt, something colder. Regret. I didn't know you'd survive the bonding, she said. Nice. Real sentimental. You were supposed to be a catalyst. Nothing more. The words hit like a punch. Kael wasn't new to betrayal, he'd lived most of his life 2 steps ahead of it. But hearing it spoken aloud, this time, from her. It cracked something. I risked my life, he said. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I stayed. I fought with you. And all this time, you were just waiting for me to drop. I was trained to protect the ship, Aelira said, her voice suddenly sharp. Not to trust strangers. Not to, hope. That last word slipped out like it hurt. Kael's anger faltered. He saw her now, not just a warrior, not just a relic of a dead empire. But someone who had survived betrayal, buried honor, and centuries of silence. She'd been alone too long to remember how to need someone else. He sat back down. "You should have told me." Aelira's voice was quiet. "Would you have stayed?" He didn't answer. They both knew the truth. The ship's console flared suddenly. Red lights blinked. "Proximity alert," Aelira said, already moving. Kael followed her to the main display. 3 signals, closing fast. "ZTH signatures," she muttered. "Warlords." "Yours?" "No. Worse." Kael's gut twisted. "Let me guess, they're not here for tea. They want the ship. And me. What about me?" "They'll vaporize you. If they're feeling kind." Kael cracked his knuckles and took the helm. "Then let's not give them the chance." The Void Dancer shivered under his touch, responding faster than it had before. It felt eager. "Let it guide you," Aelira said, strapping into the weapons console. "Don't fight it. Feel it." "Is that how ZTH marriages work?" Aelira's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Only the good ones." The first shot came hard and fast. Kael didn't move, the ship did. It rolled to the side, spun through the crossfire, and slipped behind one of the enemy vessels. Aelira didn't hesitate. Plasma beams lanced out, striking the target's rear thrusters. The ship exploded into flame and spinning metal. "One down," she said. Kael didn't speak. He didn't need to. The ship moved with him now. Through him. They danced through fire. As the second ship came in close, Aelira leaned forward, her voice calm. "Tell me something, Kael." "Yeah. Why did you stay?" He took a sharp turn, narrowly dodging a barrage of plasma. "Because, maybe I'm tired of being disposable too." Aelira looked at him. And for the first time, she didn't see a mistake. She saw a partner. The moment the last warlord ship shattered into burning fragments, Kael exhaled. Not relief. Instinct. Like coming up for air after nearly drowning. But the reprieve didn't last. Not on the Void Dancer. Not with Aelira beside him. "The others will come," she said. This was a scout wing. A test. Kael shot her a look. That was a test. Aelira nodded, already moving. "They'll send more. Stronger. Smarter. Great." He gritted his teeth, running a quick systems check. The ship was holding. Barely. Any chance this thing comes with an invisibility cloak or a self-destruct button? Aelira's fingers danced over the control surface. No. But it does have options. The console lit up beneath her hand, organic interfaces pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The ship responded like a predator smelling blood. Kael felt it again, the strange synchronicity, like the ship knew what he needed before he said it. But it wasn't just the ship. It was Aelira too. Her presence wasn't just beside him anymore. It was in him. Pressing. Breathing. "Is the bond stronger now?" he asked. She hesitated. "Yes. The more we fight together, the deeper it grows." "That doesn't freak you out?" Aelira didn't answer. That was enough. The Void Dancer banked hard to the left, guided by Kael's instinct. A burst of static filled the cockpit, then cleared. A signal. Aelira stiffened. Encrypted ZTH frequency. Military grade. The message broke through, grainy and deep, to the pilot of the Void Dancer. "This is Warlord Reek. You are flying property of the Sovereign Flame. Power down your vessel and surrender it, or be claimed." Kael blinked. "Do all warlords speak like rejected opera villains?" Aelira didn't smile. "Reek was once one of our finest tacticians. He will not underestimate us." Then we hit first. No, she said sharply. He expects aggression. We give him silence. That will unsettle him. Kael leaned back. So what, we play dead. We vanish. He didn't get a chance to ask how. The void dancer moved. Not at his command. Not hers. Its own. The ship shimmered, its hull fading to near invisibility. Kael felt the shift, like slipping between breaths, between layers of space itself. Phase Veil, Aelira whispered. One of the last gifts from the Empire. Outside, Reek's ship scattered, scanning, firing blind into empty black. The void dancer drifted past like a ghost, silent and unseen. Inside the cockpit, Kael turned to Aelira. Why does this ship listen to me? She didn't look at him. Because it wants you. Wants me. The void dancer doesn't obey orders. It responds to connection. Emotion. Purpose. Kael looked down at his hands. They were steady. He hadn't noticed that until now. Aelira leaned closer. The deeper we bond, the more the ship becomes an extension of us. Kael met her gaze. And if one of us dies? She didn't flinch. Then the other breaks. Slowly. Completely. He swallowed. The bond wasn't just power. It was vulnerability. The kind that scared him more than any plasma blast ever could. Reek won't stop, Aelira said quietly. He's after the ship. But he's also after me. He believes I'm still his. Kael's voice dropped. Are you? Aelira turned to him, gold eyes burning. Never. Outside, the stars shifted. Reek's fleet regrouped. Kael felt the tremor in the ship's core, the void dancer was hungry. He tightened his grip on the controls. Then let's make sure he knows it. The void dancer wasn't built to run, it was built to dominate. But now, hidden beneath the curtain of its phase veil, it drifted silently along the edge of a dying star system, where solar flares danced like dragons across the surface of a bloated sun. The shattered remains of abandoned mining colonies orbited in slow, decaying arcs. Space here felt ancient, forgotten by trade routes, haunted by radiation ghosts. Kael sat in the pilot's seat, jaw clenched, sweat beading on his brow. The ship pulsed under his palms, warm, aware. Its breath echoed through the metal, syncing with his pulse. He could feel it now. The bond wasn't some abstract idea anymore. It was real. And it was inside him. Aelira stood near the center console, arms crossed, posture tense. She didn't look at him. Not directly. But her presence filled the cockpit like a storm waiting to break. We're running out of time, she said. Kael didn't argue. His body already knew it. A slow burn crept behind his eyes, spreading down his spine like ice. The bond is incomplete, Aelira continued. The ship is resisting you. It won't accept full integration unless we finish the process. Define finish, he said, voice dry. Aelira stepped forward. It's not a ritual. Not in the traditional sense. It's alignment. Neural convergence. You have to let it in. Fully. He met her gaze. You mean let you in? A flicker crossed her eyes, guilt or fear, he couldn't tell. Maybe both. Yes, she said finally. Kael stood. You lied to me. I withheld, she said, firm. There's a difference. He laughed, bitter and low. You knew this thing would kill me if I didn't bond with it, and you let me take the seat anyway. I didn't know if you would survive. Most don't. Silence stretched between them. Aelira turned away, hands braced on the console. I've lost everything to this war. My home. My sisters. My identity. I wasn't going to lose this ship too. Kael stepped closer. The ship seemed to hum louder, reacting to their proximity. "You don't have to lose me," he said. "But you have to stop using me like I'm just a placeholder." She looked up. Her golden eyes met his, and for the first time, they weren't hard. They were scared. "I don't know how to trust this bond," she said quietly. "I don't know how to trust you." Kael exhaled. "Then we figure it out. Together." The ship responded instantly. Panels around them bloomed with glowing sigils. A narrow spire rose from the center console, crystalline, pulsing with energy. The convergence point. Aelira extended her hand. "Not as a warrior. As an equal." "Place your hand here," she said. "And don't hold back." Kael hesitated. Then reached out and pressed his palm to hers against the crystal. Pain. Blinding. A flood of memories hit him, her memories. Training in the temples of the flame. Watching comrades fall. Sealing herself in ice and silence for centuries. Then she saw him. The chaos of Earth. His drifting life. Regret. Grief. The countless times he should have died, but didn't. The ship screamed, then sang. The cockpit dissolved around them. Stars folded inward. Kael felt the void dancer become him. And he became it. Aelira's thoughts braided with his, sharp, fierce, vulnerable. Her heartbeat thudded beside his own. When the light faded, they were back. The ship was different now. Humming. Ready. Aelira pulled her hand back slowly, breath shaky. "It's done." Kael nodded, stunned. "We're connected." "No," she said, voice soft. "We're one." Outside, the veil dropped. Reek's fleet lit up sensors like a storm on the horizon. Kael sat down in the pilot's chair, power thrumming under his skin. "Let's show them what we really are." The sensors screamed before the first shot even came. Warning lights strobed across the cockpit as Reek's fleet surged forward like a black tide, their engines burning red and violent against the void. 12 ships, heavy cruisers, fast interceptors, and a flagship bristling with enough firepower to crack moons, formed a predatory wall ahead. Kael's hands flew across the controls, but he wasn't thinking. The void dancer was. Every flick of his fingers felt like instinct, but it wasn't just his, it was theirs. Aelira sat beside him, eyes fixed on the tactical display, her voice steady. "They're forming a trap. They want to box us in." Kael grinned through clenched teeth. "Let them try." The void dancer banked hard, skimming the edge of an asteroid cluster where fractured rock and old mining rigs floated like a graveyard. Plasma fire lit up space behind them, too slow. The ship twisted between the debris with impossible grace, phasing in and out like a ghost. Inside, it felt like riding a living nerve. Panels pulsed. The hull shivered like it could feel their enemies. And Kael could feel everything, distance, speed, angles, even emotion. The fear and fury in the enemy pilots radiated through the neural link. Aelira's voice dropped into something colder. "They're deploying boarding harpoons." As if on cue, a mechanical clang reverberated through the void dancer's frame. Kael's gut dropped. "They've latched on," he muttered. "They're trying to drag us." Aelira stood, eyes burning. "Then we fight them here." The lights in the corridor dimmed as pressure doors sealed. Kael rose, grabbing a shock baton from the weapons locker. The moment he turned, the floor beneath his feet shifted, subtly, like the ship was guiding his path. 5 warlords breached through the docking hatch with military precision. Towering figures in crimson-black armor. The first one threw caught a baton to the face, Kael's swing connected with a bone-cracking snap, but the warrior didn't fall. Then Aelira moved. She was a blur, blade drawn, slicing through armor like silk. Her strikes were dance and death in one motion, her war cry echoing through the steel corridors. Kael barely kept up, ducking a strike and jamming his baton into a joint gap. The enemy screamed. Fell. Another charged. Kael turned to see Aelira already impale him, lifting him off the floor with a brutal thrust. Blood hissed on the walls. She didn't hesitate. "You all right?" she called. He panted. "Ask me when they stop coming." A final warlord raised a plasma rifle. Too slow. Kael didn't move, he didn't have to. The Void Dancer activated a defensive pulse from the wall, slamming the attacker into the ceiling with a gravity spike. He dropped like a stone. Silence. Aelira looked at him. Her armor was scorched, her breathing heavy. But her eyes, those fierce, golden eyes, still burned. "You fight better when angry," she said. He smirked. "That explains my love life." The ship rumbled beneath them, new threat inbound. A massive signal. Kael and Aelira sprinted back to the cockpit. The flagship loomed. It was monstrous, easily twice the size of the Void Dancer, with energy cannons the size of freighters. But the Void Dancer didn't flinch. Kael slipped into the pilot's seat. Aelira took weapons. "End it?" he asked. Aelira's voice was ice. "End it." The Void Dancer launched forward, faster than light. They weaved through the enemy formation, spinning through weapons fire and releasing torpedoes at close range. The ship moved like a creature unleashed, snapping, lashing, tearing through its enemies with elegance and rage. The flagship charged its primary cannon. Kael pushed the ship into a sudden dive, scraping past the dreadnought's underbelly. Aelira targeted the exposed reactor housing. "Locked," she said. Kael grit his teeth. Then lighted up. A beam of gravimetric energy lanced out, silent and invisible, until the flagship folded. The metal crumpled inward, consumed by its own collapsing mass. Aelira leaned forward, watching it vanish. "Reek's not gone," she said. "That wasn't his ship." Kael nodded. "Then he'll come for us himself." The stars ahead pulsed red. War was far from over. The Void Dancer hovered in the wake of annihilation, the stars around them eerily quiet. A battlefield without sound. Debris drifted like forgotten memories, burned hulls, fractured turrets, still spinning escape pods with no life signs. Inside, the air hung heavy. Not from oxygen loss, but from the weight of what had just passed. Aelira stood near the viewport, her silhouette backlit by a star's pale glow. Her armor was scorched, the red glyphs dimmer than before, but she hadn't collapsed. Not yet. Kael stayed silent in the pilot's chair, every nerve humming with residual energy. His hands hovered over the console, not touching, just feeling. The ship was more than alive. It was listening. And it was in pain. He felt it, the strain in the hull, the way its pulse staggered. The Void Dancer had pushed past its limits. Again. "Aelira," he said, voice low. "She's breaking." Aelira didn't move. "She'll hold." He rose, walked toward her. "She's held long enough. What's next might tear her apart." Aelira finally turned. Her eyes were exhausted, but unwavering. "Then we become her." Kael stared at her. "What does that even mean?" "The bond is formed. But it's still, separate. You and I, connected. But the Void Dancer needs more. A fusion. Mind, will, and soul." He swallowed. "That sounds a hell of a lot like dying." "No," she said. "It's transformation." They stood in silence for a long beat. Then the ship responded. The deck beneath them shifted, forming a spiral descent into the heart of the vessel. Dim light guided the path downward. Kael glanced at Aelira, who gave a single nod. They descended together. The chamber at the core was cathedral-like, walls of pulsing organic metal, branching like veins around a single, floating construct, the heart of the Void Dancer. It radiated warmth and pressure, as if the ship itself had a soul. "The convergence chamber," Aelira whispered. "It's beautiful," Kael murmured. She looked at him. "It's alive." They approached the core, and the ship responded, tendrils of bioluminescent energy reaching toward them like vines of light. Kael stepped forward and felt his body lighten, as if gravity itself were loosening. "Place your hand on the heart," Aelira instructed, stepping beside him. He hesitated. "If we do this," he said, "there's no going back." "There's nothing to go back to," she replied. Together, they placed their hands on the core. A shockwave of light exploded outward. Kael's mind left his body. He was everywhere, riding the stars, seeing through the hull, sensing the curves of time and space. He was the Void Dancer. And Aelira was with him. They shared thoughts. Memories. Regrets. Kael saw her as a girl, kneeling at the ZTH Flame Temple. The day she earned her first blade. The moment she buried her sister. The night she sealed herself into stasis. She saw him watching Earth from orbit, alone in a cargo hold. Burying crewmates. Laughing when he should have cried. Then, calm. A sensation of perfect balance. Like breath after drowning. The ship spoke, not through words, but through sensation, "Welcome home." When they returned to their bodies, the chamber was different. Calmer. Stronger. The ship purred with new life. And Kael and Aelira? They didn't just command it now. They were it. Space rippled around the Void Dancer as it emerged from the edge of the convergence chamber, reborn. Systems pulsed in synchrony with its two pilots, no longer separate entities, but extensions of each other. The cockpit lights no longer flickered, they flowed, alive, like veins carrying thought. Ahead, the final shadow waited. Vor's fleet. Aelira's breath slowed as the tactical display lit up. Dozens of ships. Formations tight. No gaps. This wasn't a battle line, it was a noose. Kael's fingers tightened on the console. "They've been waiting for us." "Of course they have," Aelira said, stepping forward. "He always knew we'd come back." The lead ship eclipsed a nearby star, a dreadnought carved from obsidian steel, crowned with a red ZTH banner. It wasn't just a war machine. It was a message. And at its heart, Vor. The comm system activated without prompt. His voice came through, smooth and cold. "Aelira. My flame. My failure." Aelira's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. "You think bonding with a broken human makes you strong?" Vor continued. "You've deluded yourself. Contaminated your bloodline with weakness." Kael grinned. "Nice to hear from you too." Vor ignored him. "Return the Void Dancer, and I'll grant you mercy. Refuse, and I'll tear you apart, together or not." The comm cut. Aelira stepped beside Kael, their shoulders brushing. "This isn't just a fleet. It's a purge." He nodded. "Then let's be fire." The Void Dancer surged forward. Vor's ships moved to intercept, missile volleys, gravity tethers, plasma nets. But the Void Dancer was no longer a ship. It was instinct, rage, balance. It didn't dodge, it anticipated. It danced through beams like a memory, leaving only heat and wreckage behind. Aelira targeted the dreadnought's flanks. Multiple reactors. Shields reinforced. Weak point, aft spine. "Got it," Kael said. "Let's give him a scar." The Void Dancer split into 6 spectral echoes, each flickering between dimensions. Vor's ships fired blindly, caught in illusions. The real Void Dancer dove under the dreadnought, spinning upward along its hull. Kael felt Aelira's intent before she even touched the console. He amplified it. The gravimetric lance roared. A silent beam lanced upward, spearing through the dreadnought's spine. A shockwave rippled through its hull. But it didn't fall. "Brace!" Aelira shouted. The dreadnought retaliated, a wave of dark energy, raw and primal, slammed into the Void Dancer. Shields shattered. Systems flared. The bond trembled. Kael screamed, not from pain, but from pressure, the weight of the ship's survival pressing through every nerve. "We hold," Aelira growled. "You hear me? We hold." The Void Dancer responded with a roar that shook the stars. Together, they rose. They struck again, Dancer against Titan. The hull peeled away, the dreadnought's superstructure cracking open like a dying sun. Vor's face appeared on the main display, cracked helmet, bloodied eyes. "You should have stayed buried," he hissed. Aelira's voice was calm. "You should have let go." The Void Dancer's core surged. One final blast. The dreadnought fractured. Imploded. A blooming silence echoed through the void. When it ended, the Void Dancer drifted in the debris of gods. Kael slumped in his seat, breath ragged. "Tell me that was the last one." Aelira didn't answer. She didn't need to. Outside, only stars remained. The silence after war is never truly silent. Fragments of Vor's dreadnought still drifted around them, glowing softly as the void reclaimed its dead. The stars blinked without urgency, cold and eternal, as if indifferent to the destruction that had unfolded moments ago. Inside the cockpit, the Void Dancer hummed quietly, no longer straining, no longer roaring. The hum was calm. Steady. Alive. Kael sat motionless, his breath finally evening out. Sweat cooled on his brow, and his fingers trembled, not from fear, but from release. He had expected death. Maybe even welcomed it. But they were still here. He looked to his right. Aelira stood at the viewport, her posture relaxed for the first time since he'd met her. No weapons drawn. No orders barked. Her eyes were distant. "What now?" he asked, his voice raw. Aelira turned slowly. "Now we decide who we are without the war." It hit harder than it should have. Because for the first time, Kael realized he didn't have a mission. No bounty to claim. No enemy to run from. Just the quiet. And her. The Void Dancer shifted, reorienting itself. As if it, too, was uncertain what to become next. "You think they'll come for us?" Kael asked. Aelira shrugged, her voice thoughtful. "Someone always does. The galaxy doesn't like outliers. Especially bonded ones." He chuckled, dry. "Great. So we're anomalies with a bullseye on our backs." Her lips twitched. Wouldn't have it any other way. The air between them thickened, something unsaid, something inevitable. Their bond had shown them everything, pain, hope, sacrifice. Trust. Kael stood. "So, we're still married by ZTH law, huh?" Aelira stepped closer, gold eyes never leaving his. "Yes. And what does that mean? Now?" She paused, thoughtful. "Then, it means I choose to stay." Kael searched her expression. There was no sarcasm, no challenge. Just honesty. He reached out, touched her wrist lightly. "Then maybe I'll stop running." The Void Dancer shifted beneath their feet, subtle and warm, almost like a sigh. Outside, the stars waited. Endless. Unwritten. Kael looked to them. "So where to, Captain?" Aelira smirked. "Wherever we want." And for the first time, the Void Dancer surged not with desperation. But freedom.